Markets closing just moments ago, stocks surging, and oil prices plummeting after the president said the U.S. could reach a deal with Iran to end the war and that the Strait of Hormuz could open, quote, very soon. The president today making an abrupt shift, walking back his threat to obliterate Iran's power plants unless it agreed to reopen the strait by tonight. Instead, announcing he was postponing any and all military strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure for 5 days, saying the U.S. and Iran were having productive conversations to end the war. Here's more of what the president said about those talks.
Well, we've had very strong talks. Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner had them. They went, I would say, perfectly. I would say that if they carry through with that, it'll end that problem, that conflict, and I think it'll end it very, very substantially. We're doing a 5-day period. We'll see how that goes. And if it goes well, we're going to end up with settling this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out. They want to make a deal. And we are very willing to make a deal. It's got to be a good deal. And it's got to be no more wars, no more nuclear weapons. They're not going to have nuclear weapons anymore. They're agreeing to that.
Now, it's unclear who specifically the Trump administration is speaking to in Iran. President Trump would not say, and again, boasted that all of Iran's top leaders were dead, and Tehran denying any such talks have happened. The head of Iran's parliament posting a social media quote saying, quote, no new negotiations have been held with the U.S., and fake news is used to manipulate the financial and oil markets and escape the quagmire in which the U.S. and Israel are trapped. As for that vital shipping lane, President Trump now suggesting the Strait of Hormuz could be jointly controlled by him and Iran's next supreme leader.
About the Strait of Hormuz, who's going to be in control of that?
That'll be opened very soon if this works.
How soon? And who's in control of it? Will Iran still be able to control the flow of oil?
Be jointly controlled.
By whom?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
me and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is, whoever the next Ayatollah. The price of oil will drop like a rock as soon as a deal is done. I guess it already is today.
Today, crude oil settled around $88, plummeting double digits after nearing $100 per barrel on Friday. But the average price for a regular gallon of gasoline is still closing in on around $4. Iran, meanwhile, launching several major strikes over the weekend, hitting 2 cities in southern Israel, including near Israel's main nuclear site. The local hospital saying approximately 175 people were injured in those strikes. Iran also firing at a remote U.S.-UK joint military base in the Indian Ocean, renewing questions about Tehran's military capabilities and the reach of their ballistic missiles. Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez, who's in Doha, and NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, as well as NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Cheung. The gang is all here. So, Monica, let's start with you. The president has repeatedly said that Iran's leadership is gone. He said, if their leadership is gone, who do we know about who he's having these talks with? Who exactly are officials talking to?
We don't know, Ryan, and that is a very key question here. And the president didn't want to reveal that, only saying that this person is in a position of power, is a top person, is somebody who could potentially have some influence. But the United States is not the one who wants to communicate who that may be. All we know is that from the U.S. side of things, it seems to be the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his special envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, that are participating in these talks, these negotiations. But we just don't even know what stage they are in, Ryan. Initially, the president did try to say that they had been ongoing, but then he kind of shifted that to say they were really just preliminary conversations that maybe are going through intermediaries that could potentially eventually lead to an actual diplomatic discussion. So we're not really at that point yet, but the president did seem to rule out that it wasn't contact with the current supreme leader, with the son of the late Ayatollah, that that's not who he was in touch with, raising questions also about his status, the president questioning whether he's even alive or not today. Brian.
And it does appear like it's a bit of whiplash with all of this, Monica. It seems as though the president sends us in a myriad of directions over the course of the past 48 hours. On Saturday night, he was touting the success of the U.S. military strikes. He said Iran wanted to make a deal, but he didn't. What's changed between now and then?
Yeah, just in the last couple of days, he has also said that there was nobody left in Iran to talk to, that even if the United States wanted to engage in these conversations, that there was no one who could be on the other end. Now he's saying today that there is somebody potentially on the other end. So there has been a lot of confusion on that front, and confusion about what stage we are actually in this conflict. It was on Friday that the president said he was considering winding down the war. Then he did make that threat specifically against the Iranian power plants. Then he walked that back this morning, saying that he's going to revisit that 5 days from now. So prompting, again, just way more questions than answers, Ryan.
And of course, the United States is not the only player in all of this. Even if the U.S. were to reach a deal with Iran, is there any confidence that Israel would follow suit and be willing to end their military strikes as well?
And the president was asked exactly that a couple of days ago on whether he is prepared to say that this war is over and what that might mean for Israel if they don't agree to saying that, essentially. And the president did seem to indicate that there could be obviously different motivations here between Israel and the United States, and they may have differing timelines on how this does ultimately end. We do know today, according to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that he held a phone call with President Trump. They have been in pretty constant contact over the last couple of weeks about all of this, but it is pretty clear that they do have different motivations in all of this and could have completely different definitions of what so-called potential victory is here. Ryan.
And we remember the president imploring them to stop the bombing of Gaza, and they continued despite his request. Let's turn to Raf now, who is in Doha with a view of what things are like in the region. We saw this major Iranian strike in southern Israel, Raf. What do we know about it, and are there concerns about the effectiveness of Israel's missile defense system?
Yeah, Ryan. So 2 Iranian ballistic missiles hitting in very rapid succession Saturday night. You're looking at images there of the aftermath in southern Israel. That's a town called Arad. One of those missiles falling, basically creating an enormous crater in between those buildings. Some 175 or so people were injured in these 2 towns, these 2 impacts. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying it's basically miraculous that nobody was killed. Now, the second of those 2 towns is called Dimona, and it is significant because it is the closest area to the nuclear facility where Israel's nuclear program was based out of. This is a nuclear weapons program that Israel has never formally acknowledged, but the world universally understands that Israel does have nuclear weapons. And it seems that the Iranians targeted that area because there had been either a U.S. or an Israeli strike on an Iranian nuclear facility earlier in the day on Saturday, a research hub called Natanz, which the U.S. had struck with those B-2 bombers back in June of last year. So it raises the very, very worrying prospect of tit-for-tat strikes against nuclear facilities across the Middle East. The UN's Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, says it is closely monitoring. It is warning both sides to show restraint when it comes to strikes near nuclear facilities. And as you say, Ryan, it is raising questions about the effectiveness of Israel's much vaunted missile defense system, that 2 of these ballistic missiles were able to hit in such quick succession. Right.
And it also probably raises some questions about just how effective Iran's military may be despite the beating they've taken. And when you look back at the last 48 hours, President Trump issuing an ultimatum to Iran, giving them 48 hours to open the Strait of Hormuz. But then Tehran responded saying it would hit energy infrastructure in the Gulf nations. And now the president walking back that threat. How are officials responding in the region? And is part of it that they believe Iran actually is capable of carrying out some of these threats?
Oh, yeah, Ryan, here in the Gulf, there is a real painful and learned through experience awareness of Iran's ability to keep striking. As you say, the number of ballistic missiles and drones that they are firing is way down since the beginning of the war. It's sort of averaging out at about 100 a day. But these are the countries closest to Iran. They're just on the other side of the Persian Gulf. They've been targeted repeatedly, and we are finding that it is here in Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia that it is often where Iran's weapons are most effective. I'll give you just one example of the concerns here in the region. Qatar, where I am now, depends on desalination plants for 99% of its water, right? Turning salt water into fresh drinking water. And the Iranians have been explicit that if President Trump is to go ahead with those strikes that he's promised against their energy infrastructure, that they could retaliate with strikes on desalination plants here in the Gulf. And Ryan, in a desert country as hot as this, with as little fresh water, if those desalination plants go down, that could have a potentially devastating impact.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare. Okay, Raf Sanchez, thank you for the perspective there in Doha. Let's turn now to Courtney, who's on set with me here. So, Courtney, the other strike that is getting a lot of attention is the Iranian strike on the joint U.S.-UK Diego Garcia military base in the Indian Ocean, involving 2 intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Talk to us about how significant that strike was, and what does it tell us about Iran's capabilities?
Yeah, so you can see here on the map why that's getting a lot of attention. It's because it wasn't clear that Iran would have the ability to actually fire a missile as far as Diego Garcia you see there. So we knew that. Oh, great! Now we're kilometers to miles here, so I'm gonna have to do some math. Iran has a number of intermediate-range ballistic missiles that have the ability to fly about 2,500 kilometers. We knew that. They do have some space launch ones that are believed to be able to fly more than that, more like 4,000 kilometers. But an actual ballistic missile that they would be able to fly that could hit Diego Garcia would be new. That is something that the world didn't really know that Iran had that capability. But what's really important to point out here is neither of those missiles actually made it to Diego Garcia, so it's not really clear how far they actually could have flown at full range.
But 2,500 miles is significant, and that's got to make people nervous. I mean, you've heard some new reporting about the options that the president's considering when it comes to boots on the ground. I mean, there's a lot of military experts that believe the only way you solve this Hormuz problem is potentially with boots on the ground. What could happen next?
Yeah, I don't see any other scenario at this point. So the U.S. they are hitting a lot of the potential threats to the Strait of Hormuz right now from the air. So things like their mining facilities, the places where they store their mines, the anti-ship ballistic missiles, they've gone after a bunch of those. That's been pretty successful so far. They've gone after a bunch of these ships. You know, sometimes we call them the mosquito fleet. They're these tiny little super fast small boats. Some of them are unmanned now, and they just pack them up with explosives and they send them off. The military has gone after a lot of those, but they still have not mitigated the threat, not even close, frankly. So the boots on the ground option would see the U.S. military sending troops to a couple of the small islands in the Persian Gulf. They're sort of at the base of the Strait of Hormuz. The depth of the Persian Gulf means that a lot of those bigger tankers have to go through 2 of these islands, known as Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tons. And so they have to move them through there. There's spotters. There's Iranian military equipment. They alert the mosquito fleet. They send out small boats that can surround these tankers right as they get into that choke point part of the Strait of Hormuz. It's extremely dangerous. It's a huge threat to the shipping that goes through there. Now, if the U.S. were to send in troops to the island and to some of the ports where they send out the boats, they could potentially mitigate that threat. That, combined with the continued airstrikes, it may make a difference in the Strait of Hormuz. The problem, Ryan, is even though the U.S. has control of the airspace over that area, the Iranians would most likely just bombard those islands and those ports with drones, with missiles, with anything that they can to try to stop that. It would be a dangerous mission for the U.S.
Extremely dangerous for the boots that would end up on the ground there. I do want to quickly play for you something Treasury Secretary Bessent said to Kristen yesterday on Meet the Press. Listen.
Just to put a fine point on this, though, is the president in the process of winding down this war or escalating the conflict?
Again, they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate.
What do you make of that strategy? Escalating to de-escalate.
So it's escalating to end the war, right? So we've seen that happen before in the past. And in this case, again, it would be doing things like putting U.S. boots on the ground into Persian Gulf to try, or in the Strait of Hormuz, to try to end the Iranian stranglehold on this area, and then potentially open up the possibility of some sort of a negotiated peace agreement here. I think one way that you really illustrate the escalate to end the war is with Kharg Island, because the U.S., if they were to take that, which would be logistically and everything strategically, everything about it would be difficult. But if they would not only cut off the Iranian revenue stream, but very critically, that would give them a huge point of leverage if there were some sort of negotiations, which at this point we still don't really know much about.
And 4,000 kilometers is 2,485 miles.
See, I've just have that math. I should have that right up here.
I've got to give Google credit for that. Thank you, Courtney. Brian, let's turn to you. You are our math guy. What do you make of how the markets are reacting to the president's comments today? I mean, things look better, but will it last?
Yeah, no conversions necessary on this one, but the markets were up over 1% as crude oil was down almost $10 in just one day. That is certainly big news, especially when you consider that we didn't really get any substance from the president on what those talks were all about or even who they were about. Now, I should point out that when we talk about specifically crude oil, what is still the focus of those markets moving is any sort of activity that happens in the Strait of Hormuz, that critical area where 20% of the world's oil travels through. And we've not seen any substantial improvement in the flow of tankers going through that area. You could see on that chart ahead of you, whereas before this conflict began, there were over 100 tankers a day going through that area. Today, there was only 5. That is certainly, I guess, an improvement from the 1 that we were seeing per day in the later part of last week. But that's certainly not, I would describe as an opening of that particular channel there. So, again, whether or not markets got too excited is certainly one question. It all depends on what happens going from here. But I think most traders would tell you that it's still certainly volatile out there.
And also the difference between the speculative market and how it actually impacts the everyday price for Americans, right? We saw those prices at the gas pump jack right up the second that this conflict began. Even though the price of crude's coming down, it could be a while before the average American sees that at their local gas station, right?
Yeah, well, late last night when crude oil futures were opening up, it seemed like it was going to be yet another day of prices rising. We have been watching prices at the pump at a consumer level, as far as the national average goes, inching closer and closer to $4 a gallon. The last read I believe we saw was $3.94. Certainly could be more expensive depending on where you live, like in California or Arizona. But the question is now, with crude prices having dropped almost $10 in one day, could that bleed through to consumers as well? Analysts saying, yes, it's possible that if that pattern holds, you could see prices at the pump dropping by as soon as the end of this week. But again, the big question here for supply is whether or not the Strait of Hormuz opens up. And you have analysts saying even if this conflict were to be resolved, it could still take weeks for that channel to reopen to normal traffic. Ryan?
Okay, that's how it's going to impact your family budget. Brian, thank you so much for that.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.